you have to wave that thing around?" said Johanna at the breakfast table next morning. It was a bank holiday, with no school that day. Harry ignored her and continued to munch his bacon sandwich. He was leafing through the Windmill Farm project brochure. "It's a funny sort of farming," he said, through a fine spray of crumbs. "There's not one animal in any of the pictures here. It's like he's ashamed of them, hiding them away somewhere." "Well, he should be ashamed of himself," said Johanna, finishing her muesli. "Animals ought to be out in the fresh air." "As should young humans," said a third voice, "or so I've always been told. The sun is shining, and we're wasting time." "Mr. Phigg," cried Johanna, "we've got a lot to report." He held up his hand while he took a small notebook and pencil from his pocket. He found a clean page and then said, "OK." When Johanna paused for breath 5 minutes later, Mr. Phigg was fully up to date with Kenneth Mallander's plans for the windmill site, and in little doubt of her opinion of them. He closed his notebook. "This is going to be tough," he said. "They're well organised, with friends in high places. Lots of people looking for their slice of the pie." He paused and looked meaningfully at their empty plates. "Speaking of which—" Before he could make a more direct request, Harry asked, "What do you think about eating meat, Mr. Phigg? Are you a vegetarian?" "Mostly," he said. "Not always, but mostly. My father gave me some very good advice on the subject when I was small, which I still tend to steer by." "What was that?" "He said, 'Never eat anything you can have a sensible conversation with.'" But no one can have a conversation with the animals I eat," Harry replied, like... He paused and went a little pink. "Like sheep, for example," suggested Mr. Phigg. "But most sheep can't talk, can they? It's only special ones, like Bartram and Simon, isn't it?" Mr. Phigg stuck out his lower lip and shrugged. "It's difficult to be certain. I've had some pretty one-sided chats with sheep, I'll grant you. Some need a lot of encouragement before they'll say anything, and a few of those, when they did get going, were so boring I wished they hadn't. But being dull isn't usually a good enough reason to eat someone. It's a tricky business." "Not for me, it isn't," said Johanna, with a smug smile. "Oh well," said Mr. Phigg, winking at Harry. "We can't all be perfect, can we? Now, who fancies another trip up to the Slumber Downs? We ought to compare notes with the others. The flocks had a difficult night." Then the children were both talking at once and pulling on their jackets and boots. They followed Mr. Phigg to the back of the kitchen and watched him open the little door with his silver key. He motioned for them to wait while he stuck his head out through the door. "Just checking. Yes, that's okay." Then they were out in bright sunlight, stepping onto the green downland grass. "What were you checking?" Johanna asked. "That we were in the right place. The join does move about a bit sometimes." "And what if you come out in the wrong place?" "A wrong place is all right. You might have a bit further to walk, that's all. The tricky bit is if you come out in what isn't a place." "How's that? Isn't everywhere somewhere?" "You'd think so, wouldn't you? But not always. My great-uncle Bron missed his footing in a gateway, and he had what he calls his gap year. He'd lost 3 stone by the time they found him. Anyway, we're somewhere now." They had reached the door of bed quarters. Mr. Phigg turned before going in. "I got a message first thing to say there'd been some trouble. Bartram's been hurt. Oh, don't worry," he added quickly as the children squeaked with alarm. "He'll be fine. There's just no accounting for nightmares." "Has he had a bad dream?" asked Harry. "No," said Mr. Phigg, pushing open the wooden door. This was real enough. Inside, bed quarters was buzzing. As well as Simon and Mabel, who were working at computers, there were 4 or 5 other sheep rushing to and fro with clipboards, checking coordinates on the map. Then the children saw Bartram, who was sitting at the back, with a big white bandage tied around his head. They ran up and asked him how he was. "I'm all right," he said. "My head just aches a bit. It caught me with its hoof." "What did?" Johanna asked. "The nightmare." You make it sound like a horse." "It was a horse." "Let me explain," said Mr. Phigg to the puzzled children. "Where do you think bad dreams come from?" "I don't know," Johanna said. "Just out of your head, I suppose. Sometimes you dream about something that has happened before, so it's already there in your memory." "Yes, but sometimes they're new things, aren't they? Haunted houses, savage beasts, kidnappers. You don't remember them." "Can't people make that sort of thing up?" Harry asked. "If you've got a good imagination, you'd maybe come up with some of those things. But why would you want to? It hardly makes for a good night's sleep. There's just too much weird and frightening stuff getting into people's heads every night for that to be the whole story. And what people don't make up, the nightmares bring to them." What? Johanna had trouble with this idea. But how? Where from? They can't just be ordinary horses. No. And Bartram isn't an ordinary sheep, is he? But you seem to be getting on with him all right. You're not wondering whether he exists. As to where they come from, I can't tell you. I don't know, and I'm not sure anyone else does. I haven't seen one myself, but Bartram has just confirmed what I've been told. They're tall and strong, with a coal-coloured coat and eyes of jet. They just appear from nowhere in a sleeper's mind. They leave their story, and then they're gone. Like the wind, only faster. We learnt a bit about them in our training, Bartram added. Nightmares sometimes hang around the shadow flock so they can catch a person just after they've fallen asleep. But they always used to keep out of the flock's way, and we kept out of theirs. In the last few weeks, though, they seem to be getting more difficult. We're seeing more of them, and they've started throwing their weight around, standing in our way, calling us names. One of them barged Arthur out of the line the night before last, and now I've got kicked. Oh, he shivered. You really don't want to get too close to them. The old sheep Simon had come over to join them when he heard what they were talking about. "It's a bad business, Phigg," he said, "and it's getting through to our customers. Come and have a look at this." They walked over to one of the monitor screens and watched as Mabel patched through a recording. Mr. Crookshank was back at his newsagent's in Marsham. "Well, it's kind of you to ask, but I had a terrible night. I had real trouble dropping off. I was counting sheep as usual, but I kept hearing the sound of horses' hooves from somewhere further away. Galloping, it sounded like, and coming closer. I had to start counting again 3 or 4 times. The scene switched to Mr. and Mrs. Russell's breakfast table. "And just as I was finally drifting off, I distinctly heard a voice right in my ear. It said, 'It's very dark.'" "Was that all?" "No. After a while it whinnied and said, 'But it's going to get much, much darker.' I was wide awake by that point, so I had to start counting again from the beginning." The screen faded. "Something's definitely going on," said Simon. "Take a look at the map." They turned to look at the map on the floor as he pressed a button on his keyboard. A scattering of lights appeared across the map, with concentrations where the big cities were. "A normal night spread of bad dreams, just a couple of months ago. Now look at last night." Simon pressed another button, and suddenly there were twice as many lights on the map, with the very brightest area on the south coast around Brashley-on-Sea. "Gosh," said Mr. Phigg. "Any thoughts about that?" Simon shook his head. "We can see what is happening. The nightmares are more active and more confident. They're running more missions, taking more risks, coming out of the shadows. But I've no idea why it's happening." "I think we'd better ask an expert," said Mr. Phigg. "Who?" "Brother Periwinkle. He was my old biology teacher at school, and a very clever chap too, if a little dry. I'm afraid I didn't pay very close attention in his lessons back then. I spent most of my 5th year training one of his laboratory rats to dance for a bet. I failed my school certificate, but I won the bet. You should have seen it. Anyway, I'm sure old Periwinkle will be up for a bit of revision now. It's never too late to round off your pupil's education when you're a dedicated teacher."